With the election right around the corner and our ever-expanding network of podcasts, including our most recent edition, Still a Consciousness, there's never been a better time to become a member. In addition to no ads, members receive bonus content for virtually all of our shows, an invitation to join the DSR Slack community, access to our Discord community, and enhanced show notes for select shows. Our goal is to make the DSR Network membership accessible to everyone, so for the month of May, enjoy 60% off the normal monthly or annual price for the first month or first year. Visit thedsrnetwork.com/buy and enter code MAYDAY, one word, at checkout. That's thedsrnetwork.com/buy and code MAYDAY. Thank you very much for your support.
9, 12, 10, 28, 2, 23.
This is Deep State Radio, coming to you direct from our super secret studio in the third sub-basement of the Ministry of Snark in Washington, D.C., and from other undisclosed locations across America and around the world. Hello and welcome to the podcast. It's a special podcast because we've had a news-filled weekend, and we have an especially great group because it's Monday. It's our spy show, so that means our co-host Marc Polymeropoulos is here, fresh off the Morning Joe set. But frankly, Marc, you don't look like you dressed up. I mean, don't you dress up for television?
No, so this is an ongoing joke between Sipher and I. I refuse to wear a tie. I have a polo shirt, and I was actually wearing the same sport coat for I think a year and a half, so I switched that up. But I have to stay true to my roots as a New Jersey kid, and so I will not wear a tie. I will not even wear it's just a polo shirt. And John usually makes some.
I have to say one thing. I was on TV a couple times this weekend wearing a tie, and I'm from New Jersey. We do have ties in New Jersey, but that's okay. It's okay.
But
you're
respectable. There's a difference there.
Yeah. Well, that's an excellent point. You can hear there that we are joined by our friend, one of the people with whom we cooked up this whole crazy idea, also former CIA veteran who had a lot of experience in the country we'll be talking about, John Sipher. Hi, John.
Hey, glad to be here.
I can see you're dressed down too. And then the ever elegant national security correspondent for the Washington Post. Shane, let me ask you a question. You've been breaking stories all weekend. How do you find time to do this podcast?
I mean, for the two of you and for Sipher, I mean, I make the time. I mean, this is not an opportunity I was prepared to miss. But no, while we're all waiting to find out where Yevgeny Prigozhin is, I've got 30 minutes, so we're good. We're good.
Oh, okay. Well, that's good to know. I was thinking because we've all been in the business of trying to provide insight into what we knew this was happening this weekend, when actually most of what was happening we didn't know. And even today, as of this time, we don't really know a lot. We don't know where Prigozhin is. We don't know where his Wagner forces are. I just saw stories saying they're establishing a camp for 8,000 of them in Belarus, far from Ukraine. But we don't know where they are. We don't know whether what the fates are of the Minister of Defense or the Chief of Staff of the military in Russia. We don't know what Ukraine's going to do to take advantage of this. We don't know whether Putin's weakness is going to trigger or inspire anybody else. And so I think we need to focus on some of those things and what they mean. But to do that, let's frame it with what we do know. Shane, you broke a big story over the weekend about what the intelligence community in the U.S. knew. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about that.
Sure. Well, what we found was that, obviously there have been tremendous tensions between Prigozhin and, Sergei Shoigu, the defense minister, and Gerasimov, the chief of staff of the military. And we've seen those publicly breaking out with, Prigozhin recording these fiery telegram videos where he's slinging vulgarities, the two of them. And basically, it was obvious that there was some real tension here. What we found was that the intelligence community particularly isolated this order that had been kind of enacted on June 10th, where all of the Wagner mercenary fighters in Ukraine were essentially going to have to sign up with the regular army. So they were going to the army was going to absorb Prigozhin's fighters. And what the intelligence analysts who were looking at this found was that this was sort of a bridge too far for Prigozhin, and seems to be kind of the inciting incident that led him to decide, now is the time to make a move. It's not entirely clear to us, how they obtained this information, what more they know, but they were kind of pointing to that. And of course, in subsequent days to that as well, there were, attacks, Prigozhin says, by the Russian military on his forces, which he publicly responded to on Telegram as well. So it seems like this kind of hit a breaking point when, arguably the powers that be in the Russian military apparatus try to make a move on Prigozhin, and Prigozhin says, I'm not putting up with it. And then they saddle up and ride into Rostov.
Yeah, by the way, somebody just sent me a note here that explained that I didn't actually introduce Shane properly because, we used to work together. And so I was just like, oh, there's...
It's like we're just hanging out in the office.
Yeah,
again.
It's like, oh, there's Shane. But of course, it's Shane Harris, who is writes about intelligence and national security for the Washington Post. You also do a podcast with those lawfare guys, don't you?
We do, called Chatter, yes, which we're going to record an episode later today. It's the day of podcasts.
That's everybody. We live in the world of podcasts. That's what
Indeed.
Most people do most of the time. John, as you watched all this unfold, what are the takeaways, before we get to what we don't know, that you said, well, this is absolutely the consequence, this tells me this about the situation in Russia?
Well, my goal for this podcast is to find out Shane's sources inside the intelligence community. So we're going to have to work on that, because I think there's a little ass covering by the intelligence agencies acting like, oh yeah, we knew this was going to happen. And I frankly don't buy it. I mean, we all saw the same stuff that Prigozhin was saying, and we all understood that would cause problems with Putin, because Putin wasn't, he's supposed to be the arbiter among all these big warlords, and obviously had put it off and led to this thing. So, this is not necessarily an immediate crisis solved, right? So yes, this happened. Now Prigozhin has left. You can argue that, okay, the immediate crisis of these armed people heading up to Moscow is solved. But the bigger picture, in my view, is this creates a long-term crisis of confidence in Vladimir Putin and in the Kremlin. In a country where power is totally based on image, right? It's about Putin's reputation as a strong leader who brooks no disloyalty. He's all about stability. He's all about being a powerful man. He's shown to be himself weak and incompetent. And, it adds a sense of dysfunction in domestic control that we hadn't seen before to an already sense of dysfunction in the military in Ukraine. So it's going to be something that's going to be going on for a long time. And frankly, Putin's choices going forward are all pretty bad. If he lets Prigozhin go and doesn't do anything, he looks weak. 2 days ago, he was calling him a scum traitor, and Prigozhin shot down Russian helicopters and he gets off scot-free. But if he kills Prigozhin, Prigozhin, frankly, has hit on a really powerful narrative. He's the only one that's being honest about how awful the situation is in Ukraine. He's saying that Russian boys are being sent to their slaughter while rich people in the Kremlin's kids are running around in the Middle East and Europe. That's a pretty strong narrative. And so killing him is sort of dangerous because there's probably a lot of people loyal to him, and he's sort of the Russian everyman. If he fires Shoigu or Gerasimov, this looks like Prigozhin's calling the shots and he's more powerful than Putin. But if he leaves Shoigu and Gerasimov, then Prigozhin's narrative of military dysfunction looks to be true. He's the one honest man. And frankly, it looks like Putin is nervous about the loyalty of his institutions to him. When push came to shove in a crisis, where was the military? Where were his security services? He had to worry that there was people in there that might be loyal to Prigozhin and others, and they wouldn't do anything. And I lived in Russia in the 90s. We saw that in 1991. When push came to shove, the Russian people just sat on the sidelines because, they're oppressed. They don't have a vote in their system. And so they might not go out on the street and protest, but, when the government needs them to back them, they're not there. And so there's a lot of problems going forward for Vladimir Putin. This is a one-day crisis, but I think it's going to be a crisis of confidence for months to come.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's also clear this crisis is not over, right, Mark? I mean, this morning we learned that they were going to continue to prosecute Prigozhin, right? So the narrative changes on a fairly regular basis, and there's still a lot of other shoes to drop. I want to ask you a question, Mark, though, because I've seen some of the things that you've tweeted out and said, if you're the U.S. intelligence community right now, what do you do with this? Are there things you do to try to take advantage of it?
Right, David. And so, well, first and foremost, I'm going to answer that in a second, but I do have to give a quick welcome to our guests. First of all, John Sipher was my former instructor down the farm. So I always joke around that he birthed me. I don't know how to say it.
And that hurt.
All the great successes and all the terrible failures.
Well, how come he looks better preserved than you? Is the question.
I did harder things maybe over the years. There's the big rivalry between kind of the counterterrorism world and his old world doing Russia stuff. No, but it's awesome having John. Shane was one of the first journalists, actually, when I decided to talk to work in the media. One of the first journalists I spoke to. And the amazing thing with this group right now, everybody here has been to the Vienna Inn, which is, of course, the headquarters of the deep state. So,
absolutely.
All right, back to your question on the IC. A couple things. It was interesting because there is a degree of some question on how much did we pick up, but on things like this, there's things called indicators and warning. And so really the job of the intelligence community is to provide that warning function for policymakers. And it looks perhaps that they did that. Did we really know what Prigozhin was going to do? No, but, as Shane and others has reported, there was a Gang of Eight meeting. That's the congressional leadership where presumably Bill Burns and Avril Haines briefed. So perhaps they did provide that warning. And so, what matters now? And there's two things I think that's going to be, or three things that is going to be on the mind of the intelligence community. The first is, of course, regime stability. There's going to be, all source collection on leadership communications out of the Kremlin, but also military communications. What is the FSB, the SVR thinking? And a good thing on that is when crises happen, people get yappy. This is NSA is they're popping champagne corks right now. I would think so. So there's going to be focus on leadership comms. The second is going to be just the Russian nuclear posture. That's going to be, of course, the big fear at the Pentagon in particular. So, and we have standard collection on that. But the last piece, David, I think this is what you're getting at, is how do you almost operationalize this? And this is the notion that let's now focus on Ukraine. And what can actually, and John's talked about this a lot. What can the U.S. do inside Russia now? Well, nothing. What can we do in terms of kind of affecting the situation in Ukraine? Well, perhaps up the ante a little bit. Let's send ATACMS missiles, because one of the things that this entire affair, I think, has kind of shattered is the notion that Putin is going to outlast us. And that has been it's driven me crazy. I've tweeted about it nonstop. But, the idea that this solid, stable regime of Russia is going to kind of outlast us and Western resolve will weaken. I don't think that is valid anymore, and I think that's a really big deal as it comes up. We have 2 weeks to the NATO summit. Let's see what the leaders discuss now. But focus on Ukraine, up the ante. Ukraine has their boot on Russia's neck. Step down harder.
I have to ask a question here before we go on to more serious business. Shane, you are one of the world's great foodies. I follow you on Twitter because you take pictures of your meals and you then describe them. How did they get you into the Vienna Inn, which is one of the most repulsive restaurants on the East Coast of the United States?
This is what the CIA specializes in, David, is deceit and trickery. I was told that the Vienna Inn was like a 5-star, Viennese Michelin experience with schnitzel to die for. And I walk in and I'm hit by this veil of stale beer and hot dogs. But, it was for Mark. I mean, it was really, this is what I do.
Yeah.
As a reporter. This is my hardship duty.
You are dedicated. Journalist. As you look at this right now, there was a lot of coverage this weekend where people were on TV kind of making stuff up. And I got to tell you, there are a lot of crappy analysts on TV. They bring people. I was like, oh, yeah, this guy's got a Russian last name. We're going to bring him on. He's going to talk about Russia. Or this person worked at the Department of Homeland Security. That has the word security in it. Let's have them talk about this. And so we got a lot of confusion. As you look ahead to the week ahead and you want to report this story focusing on what the critical components are, what are you looking at?
Well, what we are trying to do right now is answer the question, A, what the hell just happened, first of all? Because as we were all watching this unfold on Saturday, and I was, kind of on and have been up all night with colleagues, we were expecting potentially, Prigozhin to march on Moscow, and we would be seeing, events like nothing like we'd seen since the early 90s. That didn't happen. Everyone is kind of left scratching their heads. So, A, what happened here? And to answer that question, we are trying to find the people who are in, of course, Mark and John's line of work, who are the ones who will be listening for those communications, who will be trying to tap whatever sources they have available to understand what is this deal that was worked out? What are the contours of it? Who did what when? Because that will tell us what's perhaps likely to happen going forward. At the same time, and this is kind of to kind of riff a little bit off of your, the talking heads who go on TV and just sort of, say what they think. I'm looking to talk to people who are also confused right now. I mean, when we got assigned yesterday a story by our editors saying, we'll find out what the intelligence community knows about this. And I said, I can pretty much guarantee you they're asking exactly the same questions we are and watching a lot of the same videos on Telegram that we are. So I'm looking for people who are asking these questions and are now going to start trying to find the information that will tell them the answers and not people who are prognosticating. Also, the key things I want to watch is where does Prigozhin go? I mean, we don't know if he's actually in Belarus right now. There are reports that he has not gone there yet. Keeping track of that will be difficult, but presumably he might decide to take the telegram and tell us what he thinks again, which is often very helpful. I think we are, as ever, trying to understand, what Putin is going to do. Obviously, very difficult for the intelligence community as well. He's a very hard leadership target. I'm also watching really closely how Ukrainian officials are responding to this. I mean, one of the first things I heard from a good Ukrainian intelligence source of mine, and Zelensky echoed this, by the way, when he gave his own readout of his call with Biden on Sunday, is they're using this as an opportunity to say, give us more weapons. Putin is not 10 feet tall. You can challenge him. He is not going to use a nuclear weapon. So they are seizing on this moment of really kind of maximal vulnerability, I think, for Putin to say, come in with us and basically help us finish this thing. And so, for an administration that has predicated its intervention in the war on this dreaded escalation factor, it's going to be fascinating to see if in the next several days or a week, if the Biden administration's posture changes at all as a result of this. Like, they are not going to advocate for regime change. That's not their policy. But how will they take an opportunity of this moment of Putin's weakness? That's going to be fascinating to watch. And I think, it'll probably be subtle. It'll probably be delayed, frankly, as things often are with this administration. But that is really, really key indicators to keep an eye on.
So I want to break this down into a couple of subsets of what Shane was just talking about. I want to ask you, John, about one of the two things that I believe we can conclude from this. And that is Putin is not as strong as we thought he was. Now, whether he survives this, whether he survives it for 20 years, we don't know. But he's certainly weakened by it in the eyes of his country. He had to acknowledge it. They heard what Prigozhin had to say, et cetera, et cetera. If he, as you pointed out, if he gives in to Prigozhin in any way, that's a potential problem for him. And it's a sign that this war is not going well, because none of this would have happened if the war were going well. But here's what we haven't seen in Moscow. We haven't seen a credible political alternative, or even rumblings of one, emerge within the Russian government. There was no chance, or very little chance, Prigozhin was going to go up there and launch a coup against the government. He says he wasn't doing it. He said he was going after the Ministry of Defense. He's a thug. He's never had aspirations, I don't think, of leading a country. Do you think there are people on the ground in Moscow right now who are meeting quietly, in a park somewhere, so nobody's listening to them, and saying, the guy may be vulnerable. There may be an opportunity here.
That's possible, but I think it's going to take a little bit longer. So your point, David, about sort of humility in reporting is important here because, even in the 90s when Gorbachev fell and the Soviet Union fell, and then in 93 when they attacked the parliament, there was a ton of Western journalists there. There were a lot of independent journalists in Russia in the 93, certainly reporting on things. The Russian government was not involved in this big game of constant propaganda, disinformation, and lies. So right now, we're all of us are looking at little snippets of information and trying to make bigger predictions from this. And frankly, from what I've watched on Twitter and on TV a little bit, is that the mainstream media is actually doing a much better job than most of the experts seem to be. If you follow the Times, the Post, the Atlantic, the Economist, you're getting a much better view of sort of what this means than listening to sort of these, talking heads. But it is a mystery, and it's going to take a little bit of time to figure it out. In some ways, Putin has created this situation where he rules by divide and rule, right? And so everybody, he's the arbiter amongst these sort of mob bosses. And in some ways, you could argue that what happened here was sort of a fight among mob bosses. Prigozhin was mad that he was losing power to the military, and therefore he wanted to sort of push back against them to show that, they got to take care of his people that did the fighting. Now, the bigger question is that it does create weakness over time. I don't think that there are people sort of already planning on overtaking or overthrowing Putin. He spent 20 years making sure there's no domestic opposition. Even in the Soviet days when there was a Politburo, if the leader was terrible, the Politburo could come together and toss the leader potentially. There's none of that now. There's no opposition parties. There's no real opposition. They're in prison or not. But this sense of weakness is really important. We saw it, say, in East Germany when they had complete control. It's probably the best security state of all times. Everybody was spying on everybody. The people never came out to protest. But once they sensed weakness, all of a sudden people started talking, they started moving, and it quickly led to sort of the end of the regime. I'm not suggesting that for Russia because Putin still controls a lot of the levers of power, but he's less sure of those levers of power than he used to be in the past. He doesn't know inside the military how much loyalty Prigozhin has. He doesn't know if he calls out his military whether they will actually defend and attack other Russians. He has to worry about those kind of things now. So I think this is a longer term crisis, and we have to watch it really closely. And I think the mainstream media is doing a pretty good job of it, considering that they don't have many people on the ground.
It's true. And by the way, you hit upon a point that just weighed on me all weekend, and I saw changes nodding. It used to be that all these broadcast networks had global networks of correspondents around the world. The newspapers and magazines and others had, and all that's been drawn back. So essentially, there's like a 3-day lag for many of these networks because something happens, and then people have to get on a plane, go find a hotel, develop sources, and start reporting on things. We're at a disadvantage over where we were. And then people turn to Twitter and they see somebody and, they don't know whether that person's real or not. And a lot of the time, of course, they're not. So Mark, you have a lot of experience on the ground in these kind of things. My conclusions were this: Putin is weaker and Ukraine is stronger on the ground in Ukraine because Wagner is probably taken out of it for the near term as a factor. B, there's probably tumult at the top of the Ministry of Defense and the military. C, seeing this kind of weakness and seeing troops driving up the M4 and taking out helicopters and stuff like that has got to raise a lot of questions in the minds of a bunch of Russians who are not doing well on the ground in Ukraine as it stands right now. This offensive, which some people have talked about as spluttering, which is grossly premature, has taken about 50 square miles more of Ukraine. It is moving methodically, but it's moving in Ukraine's direction. How do you think it affects the situation on the ground in Ukraine, Mark?
David, it's a great question. And I have to go back, just based on my own experiences. So I ran a paramilitary base in Afghanistan. back between 2011 and 2012. So it was 20 CIO officers and 1,000 Afghan indigenous forces. And so I was in charge of this indigenous unit. And one of the things we spent a lot of time on was something called morale. Particularly, sometimes things are going well, sometimes they're not. And so look at the Russian military morale now in Ukraine. They're going to be obviously Prigozhin kind of made some statements which were quite extraordinary, kind of punching a hole in the balloon, which was Putin's justification for the war. They will have heard this. The terrible state of Russian military leadership, they know that. So morale is something that it's hard analytically to kind of put your hand around, but it's hard to build, it's hard to develop, it's important to. You have to keep it, and once you lose it, it's very difficult to regain that. So I think that's the problem for Russian military forces who are being asked to fight and die. The Ukrainians, you get it, they're fighting for their country. What are the Russians fighting for? Now this then switches to what does again, how do you operationalize this? And the Ukrainians have been very good. They have an information operations kind of machine, which is constantly trolling the Russians. They had, at one point, I think it was yesterday, the day before, they had a Ukrainian drone operator. He opened up his kit. This was a tweet. Opened up his kit, and there was popcorn in there because he's just watching, everything that's happening. I think you're going to see things that the Ukrainians did in the past of, sending messages. They'll have the cell phone numbers of all the Russian deployed military units. They're going to send messages saying, what are you doing? Zelensky addressed this, I think, yesterday. And so, this goes to kind of how does Ukraine operationalize this? And then I want to raise one issue too, and I'm going to shift just a quick question to Shane, because I think the Post a couple of weeks ago had a really remarkable article which talked about Budanov, the head of Ukrainian military intelligence, who has turned into a pretty influential figure in the intel world. HUR, this is the military intel shop. This is almost the new Mossad. They punch far above their weight. But Budanov had actually been, and Shane, please jump in after I'm done here. Budanov had made contact with Prigozhin. There's something there, almost that the Ukrainians have totally gotten into the Russians' head on this. And so, what does that mean in all of this? Everything that took place over the last, 48, 72 hours, I kept thinking back to that reporting. Well, hold on a second. What is Ukrainian intelligence doing here to kind of stir the pot? And Shane, you all reported this. I think you're on that byline. So, what are your thoughts on what Budanov has done previously with Prigozhin, and what they can do to kind of further their war aims?
Yeah, and as we were talking, as I was thinking, my next question of, how does Ukraine operationalize this was how does Budanov operationalize this? Because he is responsible for so many of these covert operations, behind Russian lines. The story that we did on the contacts that they've had with Prigozhin, this came out of these, leaked Discord documents that we've had access to. And what they show is that there has been this back channel between Prigozhin and Ukrainian military intelligence. And in a really fascinating episode, which it's not entirely clear what it all means, but when the fighting was sort of raging in Bakhmut and these Wagner forces were dying by the thousands, the reporting said that Prigozhin made an offer to the Ukrainians, which was, if you guys will pull back your troops, I'll give you the locations of Russian troop positions and you can go attack them. And so as this was breaking out over the weekend, I was reminded, before, Prigozhin accused the Russian military of attacking his forces, he reportedly offered to sell out theirs. So there's that tension, but there's some kind of channel. And as it's been described to us, really by Ukrainians, is like, look, it's not that they're so much trying to ally with Prigozhin, but this is a little bit of, keep your friends closer, but your enemies closer. They understand the tensions between him and Putin, and they're trying to kind of keep him in the ambit. What I'm really curious to see, and what I don't know if this will involve the Ukrainians trying to work with Prigozhin, but I think the Ukrainians see this as a moment when Putin is weak, Prigozhin is potentially weakened as well, but the Russians generally are weakened by this, and I do not think they're going to let that opportunity pass. I think, here I'm going to be dangerous and make a prediction, but I think you're going to see potentially both an uptick in the tempo and then the audacity of Ukrainian special operations inside of Russia. They will try and foment this as much as they can. They will try and encourage people who are as opposed to the war, skeptical of the war as Prigozhin is, to speak up. How they'll be able to do that, we'll see. But they've been pretty clever so far and pretty effective in at the least sending the message to Putin, we can hit you inside of Russia. We can do car bombings outside of Moscow. We can send drones over strategic bomber bases. And so I would look to see them upping the ante there as well. And frankly, at this point, and not giving a crap whether it gives the White House much heartburn about them, launching these attacks. They're gonna seize the moment.
Yeah, I'd like to come back to that point about the White House in one moment. This is the point in the show where we take a break and we tell people who are in the general public that to listen to the remainder of the podcast, you got to be a member. And for the rest of you who are members, stand by. We'll be right back. Okay, so I'm gonna go back to Shane very quickly and then go to the rest of you. I have been reading, that apropos of your last point, that the White House was like, let's not jump on this and take advantage of this, which seemed absolutely crazy to me. They've handled these things extremely well, but my first reaction was, let's jump on this and take advantage of it. So what do you make of all that?
I think it's been this position they've been in since the beginning. You're absolutely right. I mean, look, from on the official word, getting anything out of the White House and the administration was basically a fool's errand all weekend. Everybody clamped down because the White House had essentially said, like, don't breathe a word about anything. We don't want to give Putin the opportunity to say, see, this is all Washington's doing. They're meddling. So just from a pure reporting standpoint, we had to be more creative in how we went about trying to figure out what the hell was going on. But the administration, really from the beginning, as we all know, and we kind of have said it already in the discussion, has been so afraid of escalating the conflict and pulling the United States or NATO into a conflict with Russia, which I think we all agree is something that we all want to avoid. But as time has gone on, I have to say, and I don't mean to just sound like I'm parroting a Ukrainian talking point here, it has been very clear, I think, that the administration has been perhaps overly conservative in that estimation of where Putin's quote unquote red lines actually are. We have seen Ukrainian operations inside of Russia. Everyone knows it's the Ukrainians that are doing it. Putin hasn't launched a nuke. He hasn't necessarily escalated. Russian saboteurs have been sent inside of Poland, where they were caught a few months ago. Didn't get a ton of reporting, but they appear to have made it in through Belarus and were sent to try and blow up supply lines. Had they done that, I don't think you would have seen Poland invoking Article 5 of NATO. I mean, my point is that the conflict has gone to a place now where these kinds of covert operations are happening more regularly. People are kind of getting into the tempo of what this is. And sometimes it feels like the White House is still acting like it's February of last year. And that is to the unending frustration of officials in Kyiv. I think there will be some real questions about whether or not the White House would have been smarter to jump on this. Secretary Blinken did go on the talk shows on Sunday and said this shows the cracks in the facade of Russia's leadership. Okay, kind of leaning into it a little bit there. But that's about as far as they went. And that's kind of the most basic statement that you could probably make. Like, well, yeah, of course it shows that there are cracks in the facade of Russian leadership. How deep are those cracks? Are you trying to exploit them? Not that we expect him to came out a covert plan of action on live television. But I'm not sure there really even is a covert plan of action. And I think that as the war goes on, there's going to be, and maybe this will be all retrospective too, there'll be some questions about, whether the White House leaned too far back and had opportunities that they missed for strategic advantage because, they were understandably afraid of escalating a conflict that looks like it's actually harder to escalate than we thought it was back when the war began.
Yeah, definitely true. I think that's an excellent analysis where we are. There don't really seem to be any red lines. John, when I was, the last conversation I had with a senior White House official about this stuff was about 2 days before this took place. And the official said, we expect that Putin's going to draw this out till the 2024 election, if he can, because he still thinks there's a chance that if Donald Trump is elected, that could tip things in their schedule. And so he said, that's my anticipation unless a big anomalous event occurs. So then 2 days later, this happens. And I'm like, Is this the big anomalous event? Can Ukraine turn
I thought
this
the intelligence community told them it was coming, right? So guess not.
Well, no, maybe he was just toying with me, like, just a naive tourist in the White House. But the question is, can they do this? And what Shane was getting at, and what a lot of this conversation seems to be getting at, is there is a bigger role for the intelligence community, the Ukrainian intelligence, to play in this war going forward. Because you can, over the next few months, do a lot to say, hey, the Prigozhin has stirred something up. Hey, there's disinformation about little cells of people. What is Prigozhin going to do next? You can strike in. They've already started striking in Russia. And if they see a moment of weakness from Putin, you'd expect more of that. If you were in Moscow right now, or you were working with the agency right now and talking to the Ukrainians, what would you do to turn the heat up?
Well, first of all, Mark and Shane both hit on, I think, the key thing here. So what Putin's going to have to do is he's going to have to shore up his domestic post. Like, he showed weakness. He's been humiliated. He needs to crack down and show toughness at home. Like Erdogan did after his coup, all of a sudden he sort of took. So there's a lot of things that Putin could do to sort of try to regain the toughness factor. But the one thing that can really, really hurt him in the short term is exactly what Mark and Shane brought up, is the soldiers at the front. So if the Ukrainians can get information, in fact, they don't even have to make it up. They can just push Prigozhin's information about what's happening. If Russian soldiers at the front hear that message over and over, that the people in the Kremlin are filthy rich, their kids are running around Monaco and acting like kings while you're just getting, shredded and slaughtered for no reason, when in fact at home, it's not even clear who's in charge. If soldiers at the front start putting down their weapons, or they start fleeing, or those kind of things, that changes everything for Putin, right? He's going to try to control what happens at home, but if that happens in Ukraine in a big way, that could change the calculus, and his waiting for 2024 and Trump won't matter anymore. But when you go back to the White House thing, I do think there's a frustration here amongst some of us who've worked on Russia for years, because we saw it in the Obama administration. These same people who were in the Obama administration now working for Biden, they were consistently wrong and weak on Russia. And it isn't just the Obama administration. The Clinton, the Bush, and the Trump people were terrible on Russia too, frankly. But Putin always backs down under pressure. You saw in Turkey when the Russian plane was shot down. And we've seen it over and over. There's a good article in Foreign Policy by Maria Snegovana and Brian Whitmore about how Putin backs down to pressure. But consistently, administration after administration buys into his bluffs and his tough guy talk, and we end up being the ones that sort of back down and allow him to sort of push forward. He's gotten away with these bluffs, and that's sort of what led us to where we are today. So it's time, when he's showing weakness now, to believe what we see and take advantage of it. And the Ukrainians understand this because they understand the Russians. They know how the Russians lie. They know where the Russians' weaknesses are. Maybe it's time to start listening to people who know a little bit better about Russia than the people who've sort of failed in the past in Washington.
Let me just say one thing here, moderators.
You're going to support the administration, aren't you?
These guys have done a much better job than the Obama administration did, or that the Trump administration did. There is nobody who gets this stuff better than Bill Burns. Nobody in the United States government.
Bill Burns isn't the problem. It's Sullivan and those people.
Well, but I have to say, Sullivan and those people, as you refer to them, have tested every red line and crossed them. Every time somebody said there was a weapon system we couldn't deliver, you may have thought they were lagging too long, but ultimately the tanks are coming. Ultimately, the planes are coming. Ultimately, the long distance precision guided munitions are coming.
Well, they wait until every possible thing is,
Okay,
but yes, I agree.
It's not the Obama
in the bigger picture. They've done a much, much better job, and it's all good.
It's not the Obama administration debating whether to send blankets or meals ready to eat, which is
true.
Which was an actual debate that took place in the Obama administration. Mark, same question to you. How does the West take advantage of it? Is there something they can do that hasn't been done yet? Or is it just turn up the heat?
Well, I think there's lots of things that, particularly in the intelligence side. First of all, this was based on a conversation I had with someone a couple of weeks ago, I jokingly asked, who's the combatant command for the United States in this war, and the response was Langley. And so, the intelligence side of the house is really important. So it's everything from turn up the train and assist, just from the overt military to military side, send ATACMs. Like, why not do this? It's absolutely critical. But then it gets to kind of information operations. And that's where something that the U.S. certainly can help. The Ukrainians are good at it, but as John said, it's spreading that message to kind of crack or exacerbate those cracks in Russian morale on forces. And then overall, it's just that let's just stop this notion of this counteroffensive is so important, and that Putin can outlast us. I think that is something that is certainly not true. One thing, just a quick thing to add, as a kind of I was a longtime Middle East hand, and then the last couple of years of my career, I ended up having oversight over this neck of the woods. But the example I'm going to give kind of crosses both, is 2018 in Syria, and that's when the Wagner Group, Prigozhin's paramilitary force, which for at least when I was in government, we considered that an arm of the GRU, of Russian military intelligence. Everyone talks about this as a private military contractor. Wagner uses Russian military equipment. Wagner takes direction from GRU, certainly trains in its bases, and so in an exchange in the Syrian desert, U.S. Army, U.S. Special Forces, this is Delta Force, killed over 300 Wagner operatives after, frankly, the Russians picked a fight with us. And you know what the response was from Putin and from Russia? Nothing. Zip. And so it just goes back to something that John has kind of told me, since the beginning of time, when we first met a long time ago, is the way you deal with the bully is punch him in the face. And for some reason, and let me just go back to one quick thing from John, is for some reason, the CIA operations officer class, whether retired or current ones, seem to get that more than kind of the analytic class. And so I think that CIA operations officers, particularly those like John who served in Moscow, understand the Russian psyche. But the analysts who support the policymakers seem to always or continue to be soft on Putin. And that's, if I can just squeeze one thing into John, just to comment on that, because that's something that drove me crazy in government, and I imagine it stays the same right now. By the way, these are the same people who will go to the NSC meetings and kind of argue that the fears of escalation. So, John, your thoughts?
Oh, geez. Well, it's funny, living in Russia, you learn. So I lived in Russia, then I lived in Serbia after that during the Balkan Wars. And this is anecdotal and sort of silly way of looking at it. But if you ever driven in either of those countries or lived in those countries, in Russia, the people on the road are the most aggressive, obnoxious, horrible people you can possibly imagine. In the United States, if people treated you and pulled in front of you and did these things that they do routinely, in the U.S., people would pull their guns out and shoot at them. Like, it's unbelievable. But every time when Russians act in that sort of brutalist, awful way, if you make it clear you're not backing down, they back down. Always. Push comes to shove, they back down. Now, when I lived in Serbia, Serbs are just the opposite. When you push them, they escalate. Even if they know they're going to lose, they escalate. And we've seen it in politically with how they operate with their military and their paramilitaries and stuff. And Serbia's lost out because they do dumb stuff. But the Russians have won because they often do the threats and the bluffs and the obnoxiousness. And we, because they are big, understandably so, and they have nuclear weapons, we always say, hey, it's better to wait for another day. Let's back off. Let's, give him some love here. And we need to push forward. The sort of giving in to Putin over the years has allowed him to think that we're weak and we will always back down under pressure. Now, he's learning the hard way, and the administration is doing a good job of making clear that we're with Ukraine and we're going to stay with Ukraine, and that's fantastic. But he's now shown his true face. He's shown that he's weak at home. He's shown that, when push comes to shove, he gives in. He's shown that he's concerned about the loyalty of people around him. He's shown that he will back down under pressure. So let's take that under advisement and move forward.
Yeah,
John, you're not taking my bait. You're not taking my bait on the CIA case officers versus analysts. The little piece of red meat dangling in front of you.
Yeah.
Avoiding that on
well, you already said it. I sort of agree to.
Well, we'll have to come back to that. Although I think John is making a good case that more U.S. national security officials should live outside the Beltway, because if they drove on the Beltway, they would develop exactly the kind of skill set that you're talking about.
It's true.
Now, final question. We've neglected one big part of this, because Putin's weakening has a Russia consequence, it has a Ukraine consequence, but it's got an international consequence. And the United States is super, engaged in this ever since Ukraine started, and they realized, a lot of people in the global South were sort of edging towards Putin. They've been, pushing back on it wherever they could, and they've found some places where the support for Putin has been super frustrating for them, whether it was Israel or the Gulf or India. Brazil. They've found some places where support for Putin wasn't exactly what it appeared to be, like China. And clearly all those places, Shane, have watched this as well. Do you, how do you think that plays out? And do you foresee, a administration-led offensive to sort of drive home the point that this guy is not the person on whom to bet?
Yeah, that I can absolutely envision, and I would suspect you might start to see them doing it overtly pretty soon, because this does demonstrate, to the world where Putin's weaknesses are. It has humiliated him on the world stage. It is reminding people that he's potentially unstable. I mean, I should say, as a caveat to this, I think one thing that the administration fears is regime instability in Moscow. If somebody comes in to replace Putin, it might be, worse than him. So there's a tentativeness perhaps around that. But yeah, of course, there's a moment here. And when Blinken goes on the Sunday shows and is speaking to this idea that this whole event has shown that there are cracks in the leadership in Russia, that Putin is not who you think it is, I think that, to your point, David, is a pretty clear signal that that's where they're going to try and go, and at least, send the message to, Xi Jinping and others and Modi, like, are you really sure you want to get behind this guy? Doesn't seem like such a good bet, does it? And they can do that, I think, diplomatically and, and without having to take some kind of covert action that puts them in, more direct conflict with Moscow. So sure. Now, and if they didn't take advantage of that opportunity, my God, what a wasted opportunity, because here we were over the weekend thinking we were about to see a power change potentially in Moscow. And, maybe some people want their money back. The movie didn't end like they wanted, but this is just the first act of something. And there's a moment for everyone to step back here, assess, and act smartly. And I would imagine that the State Department is thinking hard about that right now.
Yeah. The Chinese did today say, "Oh, honey, we really love you." But, they say that, when they say that, you should really check, because it's like sending flowers or something. It may not mean what it appears to mean. And they have been consistently disappointed. I think one of the big lessons of this, and by the way, Bill Burns and some others have come out and said it, is that the Chinese in the past 18 months have become disaffected with their best friend in ways they won't admit, but perfectly good reasons. Anyway, this earthquake over the weekend may have been short-lived in terms of the narrative, but as Shane points out, it was a chapter. And it is a chapter at a turning point in the greater Russia narrative, the greater Ukraine narrative, and the greater geopolitical narrative. So we're going to have to track it real closely. Fortunately for us, we have the opportunity to do so with real smart, informed people like Shane, like John, and of course every week like Mark. So we encourage you to come back to our other shows. We'll be talking about this again, of course, on our Wednesday show. I suspect our Thursday show will be talking about the Supreme Court, because it's going to be a rough week in the Supreme Court, folks. I'm just telling you, buckle up. It's not going to be pretty. And we've got to deal with that. But for now, let me just encourage you all to come back, and let me say thanks, Shane. Thanks, John. Thanks as always, Mark. And bye-bye.